When you think of Force users in Star Wars, you probably think of the Jedi and the Sith, but there are a wide variety of Force traditions which have sprung up over the course of Star Wars history. So today we're going to take a look at some of the other Force traditions which have popped up in both Legends and canon. We'll start by staying close to the familiar by talking about offshoots from the Jedi Order. The Order itself, at least in Legends, came out of some prior, more localized traditions, including the Order of Dai Bendu, which originated on Thape in the Mid-Rim, and isn't to be confused with the Bendu of Star Wars Rebels, with Bendu being a term from the earliest days of Star Wars drafts. This order was mostly focused on peaceful meditation, and moved to the planet Ando Prime, where they discovered a giant pyramid they called Tho-Yor in the mountains. Tho-Yor was actually a ship which transported many of them to the planet Tython, eventually leading to the establishment of the Jedi Order. Over time, the Jedi repeatedly schismed, leading to the emergence of groups like the Order of the Sith Lords and other forms of Dark Jedi. A lot of people don't love the term Dark Jedi anymore, but I think it's still useful, because while the name is an oxymoron, it still points to the idea that the cosmology of these individuals, meaning the way they view and use the Force, is still fundamentally based on the same ideas as the Jedi. They have very different tenets about their own behavior and interpretation of what that means, but they're still fundamentally talking about the same ideas of what the Force is as this energy that surrounds and binds them and where it comes from. This goes all the way down to even more specific concepts like the dark and the light side. This is definitely not a universal concept, so in my opinion, Dark Jedi is still a useful term, and the Sith Lords largely fit into these same ideas as well. Other specific sects did branch off of the Jedi at different times as well, and that sentence took me like 10 times to say. Some more closely adhering to the basic commandments of the Jedi with a more local flair, like the Corellian Jedi, also known as the Green Jedi. These Corellians were, for most intents and purposes, still part of the Order, but they were a bit more self-governing. This order was home to Nejah Halcyon, grandfather of Corran Horn, one of the future Jedi Masters in Luke's Order. Other breakaway groups were a bit more divergent from regular Jedi thought. The biggest example of this is the Jinsari, a group which arose under the leadership of Nico Tiris during the Clone Wars, and who tried to merge some of the Sith teachings with the Jedi, based on a Sith holocron Tiris had been given by Count Dooku. This essentially meant that they were a sect of dark side wielders running around under and just after the Empire, although many of them were redeemed after Endor and joined Luke's new Jedi Order. Throughout the galaxy, there were also a series of more local planetary Force sects. Many of these arose in the days just before the Jedi, like the Dai Bendu did, and while some were essentially integrated into the Dai Bendu and Jedi Order, others continued as independent traditions. One of the more famous examples of this were the Baron Do Sages, a monastic order of the Keldor, or as most people call them, Plo Koon species. They largely viewed the Force the same way as the Jedi, down to going to the exact same tailors. The biggest difference is that they were non-martial. They didn't learn to fight the same way Jedi did, they didn't have lightsabers, although they were able to use electric judgment, a Force power that is totally legally distinct from Force lightning. In-universe, you can interpret their robes as being a sign of interconnectivity between the Baron Do Sages and the Jedi. Most Force-sensitive Keldor joined the Jedi after the Republic formed, and as a result, the Baron Do were fairly obscure and almost seen as a mythological order. Other worlds and other species had similar orders, like the Dagoian Order, who, much like the Baron Do, viewed the Force itself in a similar way to the Jedi or Sith, but didn't train themselves as warriors. When I say they saw the Force a similar way, I mean they were still interacting with something that they and the Jedi would have recognized as being the same entity, and they wouldn't have had many disagreements over the nature of that entity. The biggest difference was that the Dagoians didn't use it to do anything, they simply meditated and tried to make themselves part of it. In some places, the culturally specific interpretations of what the Force was and what they did with it were both a lot more divergent. They didn't have the same precepts as the Jedi, and didn't always even understand the Force as the same thing, seeing it more as a specific tool, or in some cases, even just using it as a core part of their biology or technology. One example of the former are the Chiss Skywalkers, introduced by Timothy Zahn in the new canon in his Thrawn Ascendancy trilogy, though he did give an offhand mention to them in an earlier book. The Chiss Ascendancy existed in the unknown regions, where navigation was difficult as hyperlanes were unstable, so the Force was used to navigate for long-distance trips, with precognition being used to determine safe hyperspace lanes. The ability to see and use the Force in this way was called Third Sight within the Chiss, and was primarily a utilitarian rather than religious idea within Chiss society, particularly within the Chiss Expansionary Defense Fleet, who had primary guardianship over the Skywalkers. Force sensitivity seemed to primarily, if not exclusively, express itself in young female Chiss, although this talent also typically receded as they aged, with most Skywalkers losing third sight by their early teens. One of the most powerful factions in the Unknown Regions was called the Navigators Guild, where multi-species groups like the Pathfinders and the Void Guides would use their more permanent Force abilities to guide any clients through the Unknown Regions, using those abilities in much the same way as the Chiss and following strict codes of confidentiality on their own trade secrets as well as their clients, given the volatile nature of relationships between states in the area. The only way they could really guarantee their own safety was by liking this video and subscribing for more. This utilitarian approach to the Force was also seen in a different way in the once galaxy-spanning Rakatan civilization. Force sensitivity among Rakatans was an almost universal trait, and the Force was used to power a lot of their technology, including hyperdrives, star forges, and electric pencil sharpeners. Their technology was primarily fueled by the dark side, despite the more balanced approach of their precursors and mentors, the Qual species, who they basically killed and took over from. Specifically, they would enslave Force sensitives around the galaxy and convert the dark side rage and despair of those individuals into a form of energy they could use. Eventually they fell into a civil war, ending with the species being almost entirely cut off from the Force, rendering their once vast so-called infinite empire into a few pockets of squabbling, isolated groups like what you see in Knights of the Old Republic on their historical capital of Lehon. Still other species had the Force as a core part of their biology, for lack of a better term, or how they operated as a species. These were species like the Stenny Shifters, which had universal Force abilities specifically tailored around letting them blend into crowds, by essentially erasing themselves from the perceptions of others. The Unzadi were more or less space vampires who would hunt down prey, especially Jedi or other Force sensitives, drinking their life force. This relied on some sort of interaction with the Force both in hunting and in actually eating them. The Talartai, also known as that bird guy species from Empire at War, similarly had a high or even universal incidence rate of Force sensitives, although without a particular cultural interpretation of it that we know of. Uri Fen, the character from Forces of Corruption, was able to sense the light and dark sides of the Force in Empire at War, seemingly thinking about it in a similar way to the Jedi and the Sith. And another Talartai character in the New Canon High Republic books, Udi Dis, used his Force abilities as a navigator. More towards the Anzadi side of the spooky spectrum, the Drengir were an extreme version of this, as a species of plant-like critters who acted under a collective consciousness attempting to corrupt and then consume others, corrupting and then ingesting Force sensitives and non-Force sensitives alike. All of these species, and all other examples like the Miraluka, who use the Force to see, don't necessarily represent traditions per se, but they do go to highlight that the relationship between beings and the Force was not universally described by what the Jedi would experience or their philosophy around how it can or should be engaged with. None of this is of course to say that the Jedi were wrong or that the Force didn't exist in universe, but there's plenty of places where ideas about the Force get played with in different ways, often with very clear implications for what the characters are able to do with that. This gets even more obvious when you get into some of the entirely different religions built around what other people's ideas of the Force were. In some of these cases, the Force and Force powers presented entirely differently. The most prominent example, but not the only example, are the Night Sisters, whose magic is connected to the Force in some way, and it seems like the people capable of Night Sister magic are capable of using the Force more traditionally or vice versa, based on the limited information we have with characters like Ventress. But this could also be a situation where it's not entirely accurate to just describe their magic as being the Force. There were differences which evolved between the origin of the Dathomiri witches and Night Sisters in Courtship of Princess Leia, the novel from the 90s, and their inclusion in the Clone Wars by George. But the magic of the Dathomiri was described as having a few different sources, in more of a regular Jedi/Sith style dark and light binary. The more traditionally light side witches who we saw return to canon in Tales of the Empire modeled their form of magic from the Book of Laws in Legends, which had been written hundreds of years before the Empire by a Jedi named Alia. She had also written a code which was inspired significantly by the Jedi Code. Then we have the Night Sister version of magic, which was originally claimed to have come from the Book of Shadows, but which we now recognize as the green mist which the Night Sisters can use to even reanimate corpses, something the Jedi traditionally don't do, and which Yoda would probably say is not an epic thing to do. Unlike some of the examples that we're going to be talking about or have already talked about, this is an area where it is a bit less clear on how universal these powers can be, which is why there might be something more than the Force at work there. The Night Sisters probably represent the most common and most divergent version of what at least can be loosely called a Force sect, and I really think this helps highlight just how similar or different other versions of how people see the Force compared to the Jedi really are. For example, while we're on the topic of witches, brief spoilers for the Acolyte episode 3 here. The coven the main characters May and Osha come from shows a lot more in common with the Jedi philosophy than some of what we see in these other examples. We don't know much about them at this point, but their conception of the Force is what Anastasia calls the thread, binding everything together. Their demonstration of powers are also similar to standard Jedi skills, with the exception of the whole black eyes thing. And the thread as a metaphor has a lot of similar ideas to the Force, especially compared to what we see of the Night Sisters or even Witches of Dathomir, and then some of the other examples we're about to get to, just with a few key differences. First, Anastasia criticizes the idea of the Force as a thing to be used, alleging that the Jedi inherently put themselves as masters of it and therefore above others. I think ultimately this comes from a position of her institutional opposition to the Jedi, rather than a real difference in how the Jedi would pose their relationship to the Force, especially given other comments made in the show about pulling the thread and the control the witches do exercise over it, in much the same way as the Jedi. It's entirely a difference in framing. But moving away from witches, we have some other Force traditions which diverge from the Jedi even more in powers and philosophy. Some of the most alien belong to a region of space in legends called Cathal. There were a few different, smaller or less known Force traditions in the area, but most famous were the Angti monks, an order or a species which are apparently mammals but to me look very much like lizards, and who built organic spaceships while using their Force powers to go after pirates. They were described by George Cardass, a smuggler and former associate of Thrawn's, as having a different view of the Force than the Jedi, although it was still described as the Force, or even possibly drawing their power from a different element of the Force altogether. So in a lot of ways in practice, there is some parallels between the Angti and the Night Sisters and how they're reflecting a different type of power here. One of their key powers was teleportation, which they used to travel incredibly quickly through their local region of space, though they typically didn't venture outside the Cathal sector. This power was also used by George Cardass himself, who had studied under the Angti while not showing particularly high levels of Force talent anywhere else. He used it to much less impressively move a decanter from one room into another. Cardass described the Angti's view of the Force as a rainbow rather than dark and light, which may have contributed to the Jedi embracing a less binary view of the Force called the Potentium after the end of the Yuuzhan Vong War, when Jacen Solo studied with several different Force sects, including the Angti, and brought this kind of information back to the Jedi. The Potentium is a whole other video, and Jacen did end up becoming a Sith Lord right after, so it didn't work out super well for the Jedi. One of the more powerful techniques of the Angti, called flow walking, allowed them to visit the same location in the past, or more dangerously, in the future. This technique was used heavily by Jacen leading up to and after his own fall. And this gives us an important hint at what's going on here, but we'll get to that in a second. The final order we're going to talk about today, no not that one, existed prominently within the Legends continuity and was known as the Adepts of the White Current, or the Falanasi Order. This group was exclusively women, and while they taught that the Falanasi should serve their own desires, they were explicitly non-violent. And one of their members, Akana, was very critical of Luke using the Force in his conflict with the Empire. She led Luke to believe that his mother had been a member of their order long before George was going to allow anyone to tell the real story of who Luke and Leia's mom was. But Luke, and especially later on Jacen, did learn at least some of their techniques. Their powers didn't include any telekinesis, instead focusing on perceptions. On one end, this meant being able to create images of things that weren't there, and on the other, this could mean fully disappearing themselves and even objects from the perceptions of others, whether this was standard perceptions or even electronic surveillance. Akana used this to help sneak them into and out of places that would have otherwise possibly objected to their being there. It's a technique that's also later used by the Jedi to hide the Praxium on Yavin 4. And as that implies, these last two, the Angti and the Falanasi, are probably the biggest examples of how much impact their different religions or philosophies about the Force impacted their practices, since both are areas where we know dedicated Jedi, or even people thought to be otherwise not Force sensitive, were able to pick up these techniques given enough time and teaching. This list isn't exhaustive, with others like the Guardians and Order of the Wills being out there, but hopefully it helped give you some ideas of the variety of Force perspectives which existed throughout the galaxy. If you've enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.